Thank you very much, Michael. Hello, I'm Charles Lincoln. Following up on the domestic legal environment and regulation, the domestic regulation must be in harmony with the international treaties the U.S. has signed on to. Indeed, this can often be a complicated process as the domestic legislation and regulation can amount to over 2,000 pages. First, let's talk about the history of how these treaties kind of came together. First, we had the Buy American Act that came about in 1933. It outlined the domestic preference rules for government procurement and has been amended several times since. In 1948, the GATT agreement, which was also amended in 1986, the General Agreement against Tariffs and Tariffs and Trade, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, came into effect that allowed for only domestic preference for government procurement, and also prohibited domestic preference legislation in the private sector. In 1993, NAFTA came about with a specific requirement with one of many provisions indicating that the U.S. federal government consider Mexican and Canadian manufacturers as being domestic manufacturers for U.S. government procurement as long as those contracts with the government met a certain minimum threshold. Interestingly, if we look at the NAFTA-like agreements, we see that 129 countries Interestingly, if we look at the NAFTA-like agreements in terms of the domestic preference provision, we see that 129 countries share the same unique advantage as the NAFTA agreement in allowing these other countries to be considered as domestic manufacturers for U.S. government procurement purposes. As long as they meet certain minimum thresholds for government contracts. The question then becomes, which countries with major manufacturing capabilities are not considered as domestic manufacturers under the Buy American provisions? If you look at the map, essentially it's the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, Indonesia, China, as well as Egypt and South Africa. So, having this knowledge in mind, this leads us to our possible Having this knowledge in mind, this leads us to our possible policy options. There are three. Having this knowledge in mind, this leads us to the possible policy options. There are three. Keep the status quo, eliminate it completely, or keep key provisions. We suggest the third option to keep only the essential elements, specifically the limited items important for security, for national security, as outlined in the Berry Amendment. Our suggestions are to get rid of the aspects that make the Buy American Act a disadvantage, and keep the advantages by finding better ways to achieve these positive aspects, while also considering whether NASCO and other interested entities should really try to fix the Buy American Act for Mexico and Canada, or rather, expand it to other countries that are not considered as domestic manufacturers. However, if NASCO chooses However, if NASCO chooses to focus solely on Mexico and Canada, it could focus on figuring out ways to reduce the minimum threshold of government contracts so as to allow smaller businesses to enter the market.